Hi, everyone. Thank you again for joining us at the 2022 Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. This competitive advantage talk is presented by Kager, also known as Craft Analytics Group. My name is Jen Whaley, and I'm a first-year MBA student at MIT Sloan. It's my pleasure to introduce the presentation, How AI Unlocks Better Sponsorship Measurement, presented by Hive. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Dan Kalpin, president of Hive, to the stage.
Hey, everybody. My goal for the next 30 minutes is to talk about something that you probably already know at some level, but historically the industry has not been able to quantify. And that's the significant amount of value that is generated in media content for brands within sponsorship, and specifically the subset of that is typically not measured by most rights holders and teams. This analysis is the product of AI and big data, which admittedly are two of the most overused tech buzzwords in recent years, so I deeply apologize for using them in the sentence together. But it's the way that the analysis here was done. AI allows us to reimagine sponsorship measurement, unlocking faster, more comprehensive, and more granular measurement of brand exposure in content. And this is something that's relevant to every brand, and that it allows them to more fully understand the value of their investments, and is also relevant to every rights holder to enable them to better price their assets. Sports programming on television in the US across national TV and regional sports networks is worth $12 billion in equivalent media value. A massive number that we've built bottoms up by looking at every brand in every second of every program across just about every national and regional sports program on television. And when you step back at that creates a tremendous amount of value that we put as equivalent media value, or effectively how much would that brand need to invest in traditional advertising to achieve a similar level of impact, measured as the time that a brand is exposed, discounted by the quality of that exposure. Just to put this number into perspective, if you look at this $12 billion, about $10 billion of that comes on national networks. So no regional networks, but your ESPNs, your ABCs, your Foxes, your CBS, et cetera. And the total amount of dollars spent on traditional advertising from 15 and 30-second ads is about $11 billion in a year. And so effectively, the value that sponsors are generating inside of the game is roughly the same dollar for dollar as the dollars that advertisers are spending around the game. As another point of calibration, if you look at the sponsorship revenue that rights holders are earning, the top 4 US leagues, the NFL, the NBA, Major League Baseball, and the NHL, last year had about $5 billion in reported sponsorship revenue, led by the NFL, which last season had about $1.8 billion. There's obviously more as you bring in broadcast partners, other leagues and federations like the NCAA and the PGA and NASCAR. But there's an argument to be made that actually the media value from TV alone is significant enough to match the dollars that brands are investing into sponsorships. Another reason that this number should feel large is because it actually counts more than traditionally can be measured. Given complications with how measurement typically happened, which some of you may know was a very painful and manual process, it typically was limited to what we would call whistle-to-whistle measurement, effectively looking at the biggest games from the time they start to the time that they finish. When you can actually look across the landscape of programming, you can tell a richer story. And that is that there's almost $2 billion of exposure in the long tail of sports talk and highlights and shoulder programming. And when you add that up, you can fundamentally tell a different story about brand exposure. Let me start with an example from a couple of weeks ago that may be familiar. Probably anyone in this stadium or in this room would know that the stadium naming rights holder in the stadium in Los Angeles, my hometown, is SoFi, which has prominent placement inside and outside of the stadium. And if you watch that game, you'll see that brand exposed, but like any native asset, there's a high amount of variability in a given telecast for how much the brand is exposed. Looking at the regular season and playoff games for the Rams and the Chargers, that ranged from a low end of about 36 seconds of exposure to the high end of almost 4 minutes of exposure. Same signage, but different gameplay, different camera angles from different broadcasters, et cetera. The exposure during the Super Bowl a few weeks ago was on the lower end of average for SoFi, a little bit over a minute on the screen, actually trailed the naming rights holders' exposure over the past 3 Super Bowls. But for anyone who watches TV, you know that that's only a part of the story. If you looked at programming in the week before or in the week after, SoFi and its affiliation with the Super Bowl and SoFi Stadium was everywhere on TV. Whether it was reporters or correspondents inside or outside of the stadium, leading up to and after the game, or in the week following, the brand being exposed within highlights from the programming. And when you look at measurement inclusive of all of those exposures, it's actually a fundamentally different story. So for SoFi, in addition to the Super Bowl itself, there were 544 unique programs on national and regional sports television in the week before and the week after the game where the brand was exposed. When you add that all up, that's 509 minutes of additional exposure on the screen in front of different audiences in different programs, building on the 1 minute and 14 seconds available in the game. As you would imagine, the amount of reach or media weight that created essentially quintupled the impressions from the game itself, unlocking an additional 427 million household impressions exposed to the brand. And when you put all those pieces together, it increases the value that SoFi realized from Super Bowl-related exposure on television by more than 50%. Now, sure, the Super Bowl is unique in that there's more exposure before and after the game compared to other typical games on a regular season basis or pretty much anything else on television, but this story actually holds true. And so now let's zoom out and look at the top 1,000 brands over the past year. And you're gonna see a very similar story. And so of those 1,000 brands, the median increase from screen time, when you look at the amplification of exposure in all those sports talk and all those highlight shows and all that shoulder programming, actually increases by 44% over what you would just get within the game. When you layer on viewership, that increases the amount of household impressions achieved by 77%. And as that comes to value, at a median level, increases the value that brands realize for their sponsorship investments or that rights holders can speak to on those investments by 19%. And that means there's more than 500 brands in that 1,000 that are achieving more than 19%. Yeah, sorry, I just defined what a median is. But also for the top 25% of those brands, actually 250 brands achieved more than a 38% lift in the amount of media value by measuring inclusive of sponsorship. So it's a very meaningful level. Now, when you put all those pieces together, it's not just coming from the biggest networks, but is actually spread across a very fragmented set of content. So about $1 billion of that $1.8 billion comes from national TV. And so that's your ESPNs, that's your CBS, that's your Fox Sports, et cetera. But regional sports networks in aggregate also have a material impact, making up about 40% of the total amplification volume. Now, what's interesting is even within national TV, that's an incredibly fragmented amount of exposure. So there's more than 860 unique programs over the course of the year that were driving amplifications from brands. And it might not surprise anybody that SportsCenter drove the lion's share of that, essentially more than a third of all the exposure on national television, more than 20% of the total exposure on television in general, but even just measuring SportsCenter would leave a lot of dollars in measurement on the table. But on SportsCenter, the power can't be denied. There were more than almost 1,200 brands during the course of that year that received amplification on SportsCenter programs alone. So that's defined as essentially a brand being present on an individual day for more than 2 seconds. So a tremendous amount of reach and amplification just on SportsCenter alone. But as mentioned, this is more than a SportsCenter story. So another way to think about it is what's the inventory of occurrences that could exist? And when you look at that, it's a pretty significant number. So there's more than 700,000 individual programs times brands that received amplification outside of the content of games over the course of the last year. And what that means for some of the top brands who are the most active in sports with different types of placements is there's a tremendous amount of exposure and value from those placements. If you look at, this is the top 20 brands as defined by equivalent media value achieved in games. So think of it as seeing signage, logos on jerseys, swooshes on cleats. Nike leads the pack with that. And Nike, in addition to everything that happens whistle to whistle, was actually in 22,000 unique programs during the course of the year, which I have to imagine is pretty close to just about every program that there is. But as you follow that down, you'll essentially see some of the stalwarts of sponsorship and a significant amount of exposure that shows the value of being able to detect this from the reach and the exposure on top of it. So let me take a step back and acknowledge that media value is just one piece of how folks on both sides of the table look at exposure, but we think an important one. But ultimately, there's 4 different pillars that most folks will think of when they think of sponsorship value. Obviously, the hospitality, the events and the tickets, direct sales for the brands that have poor rights at games or things of the such. Sales lift, so how much does my exposure or my affiliation with a team or a league or a network contribute to my business outcomes? And then finally, what we've talked about in terms of media valuation, how much exposure am I earning for my brand? And we obviously just talked about TV, but is obviously broader. Now, each of these are valuable, necessary, but individually, not everything by themselves, and frankly, from a measurement perspective, have challenges. So there's one piece which is important is what's the relevance? Something that may or may not be relevant for a given metric to a given type of brand. Contribution to ROI, so something might be relevant, but is not the most significant driver of value relative to the level of investment. Measurability, can we even measure it? And latency, how long does it take to get the data? And so when you think of these 4 different elements, they each have their own story. For hospitality, actually relatively measurable, relevant to all brands, but I don't think anyone would confuse sponsorship with arbitrage for ticket prices. It's meaningful, but it's a piece of the package. When you think about direct sales, that's relevant for certain folks. If you think of the alcoholic beverage or the soft drink companies, but a very small amount of people who are able to sell their product at a game. For the ones who can, they can actually typically measure about 40 to 60 cents on the dollar. So a small amount, but they can measure quickly and they can measure fully, but that'll only impact some brands and some categories. From a sales lift perspective, the management consultant in my former life was trying to figure out which Harvey ball to use for this. Sales lift, obviously an ultimate objective for any brand. Not necessarily why every brand does a sponsorship, but generally very relevant. But the challenge, not intended to be a joke, but a question mark of I think most brands don't necessarily know what the sales lift is because it's such a hard thing to measure. And if you think of the purchase cycle, especially in a category like auto, where there's so much exposure over so much time before a purchase, a really hard thing to measure. And so that gets to media valuation, which I'll put into 2 buckets. One, a legacy approach of how this has been done for many years, and a second one, which is as you bring AI, how does that change in certain areas? In general, every brand sees value from exposure, obviously a big piece of why these investments are made, and so a highly relevant component. Traditionally, even whistle to whistle, looking at the big events, you can see a meaningful amount of exposure that's been generated. And it's relatively measurable. Again, somewhat a painful process. It was maybe more manual than folks would like, but in general, something that you could measure. But now you have the ability to measure more to this example with better granularity and ultimately increase that value. And probably one of the other pain points was, this is good data, but it takes a long time to get it. Sometimes several weeks, sometimes a couple months after the last event. Now you're in a world where essentially that can be real-time measurement, which allows for both optimization as well as just scratching the itch of urgency. So how do we do this? So taking a step back, Hive is a tech company in the AI space. Our business is focused on working with companies across industries and across use cases to help them understand what's happening in video, what's present in an image, what is said in audio, what is meant in text. Sponsorship measurement is one of those capabilities that uses multiple of our core models, where we use logo detection to understand the presence of a brand, logo placement, so not only that the brand is in the content, but which asset that placement is located on. We didn't talk as much about the audio side of this, but also verbal mentions, especially for broadcaster assets, a really important part of the story. So those are essentially the core components of the solution itself. And then each of these detections, as you'll see in the example image, are also scored for what we call their equivalency. So based on, not all seconds are created equal, and the larger, the clearer, the more central, and the more exclusive a given placement is, the more value it has, or essentially the more that equates to an equivalent ad unit. However, our models, we actually license across the industry. So some of you, without knowing, might have actually used Hive's technology before, but that actually doesn't get all the way to being able to tell the stories like today, and that's where the proprietary data piece comes into play. So in addition to the models, and I'll talk through an example with linear TV, since that was the basis for the data today, we've actually set up a massive set of ingestion, where we essentially sit at the head end and get the full streams of linear content. And then run that through our models, looking essentially every brand, every second of every program of every day, which ends up being about 3,500 hours of content on an annual or on a daily basis, north of 1.2 million hours of content that's processed on an annual basis. So a tremendous amount of data. Once we get our own occurrences, we can then match that into other data sets like viewership or program level spot costs to say, for this exposure, who saw it and how much was it worth. And when you put all those pieces together, can create the data feed that essentially has 14.5 million rows of data added every day, about 5.3 billion rows of data over the course of a year. And when you can see that universe view, it allows you to understand not only how a given brand or a given asset is performing, but also to unlock competitive intelligence and benchmarking on how are other rights holders selling their sponsorships, how are other brands investing in a given sport, which sports are other brands investing in. And so these two pieces together creates a tremendous amount of understanding, and we put those pieces together in a platform that we call Mencio, which essentially looks at every brand, every second, every game, updated every day, with the ability to view all of this data in a point-and-click fashion that allow brands like Anheuser-Busch and Walmart, network owners like Disney to understand more about content around the sponsorships that they're buying or selling, and make better decisions off of that. So with that, I love the space, I love this topic, and I hope that you found the information here interesting and useful. Feel free to get in touch, send me an email to dan@thehive.ai, add me on LinkedIn, or stop by our booth. We've got some folks in the main hallway that would be happy to share some of the data, share a demo for your brand, team, or league of interest. But I think we have a few minutes, so I will pause there. But if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Thank you.
Certainly a relevance to Meet the Bears. To what extent, if at all, are you looking at how valuation is impacted by association with either positive or, in my case, more often negative events where, if it's a bad outcome or, and the logo's right there behind the coach in a press conference after the game, and they're pissed about that because the coach said some things that weren't so great. To what extent are you guys considering that, and what are some of your thoughts around that?
Yeah, it's a good question. As a lifelong Mariners fan, I share the sympathy. So I think it's a really good question. I'd probably answer that in two different ways. I'd say at a foundational level, we believe that the base foundation should be being able to detect an exposure, and that actually that hasn't been as much of a commodity. And so knowing that a brand was present at a given time is kind of step one. And then I think there's a lot of things that can be done on top of that. One of the other one that comes up a lot, and another way that we power some of our partners is from outcomes data sets, where to that kind of daunting third column of sales lift is the question of what impact did this have offline, especially in categories like FMCG or quick service restaurants. Being able to identify those exposures can actually enrich some of the attribution reporting that different services or different networks are doing. And so I think we see ourselves at the foundation of being able to tee up that analysis across the industry. Good question. Any others? Yeah.
Sorry, give me 1 second to get over there.
Hi, so TV visible assets are definitely the hot commodity among the sports space or any entertainment space. What kind of valuation do you offer, if at all, for non-TV visible assets that might still be prominent in the stadium or in the anything else?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we think of ourselves and the way we work with folks is on a very cross-platform basis. TV is, I think, unique and in some ways solves that need of there's so much content broadly that it's been harder to measure. And so the focus here was to essentially say, let's not move on to the next thing without getting all of the benefit of what exists. Obviously, there's more fragmentation where things live in an OTT world, in a streaming world, et cetera. And so I think our focus has been largely kind of earning the trust of folks that they will want us to measure, and then as more things go to private platforms and behind walled gardens, can start to unlock that with folks.
Just knowing that this isn't necessarily differentiated all that much from like a Repucom or futures, what would you say, like your elevator pitch, is it that the Mencio portion that you can benchmark against competitors, or what would you say the key differentiator is?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yes, I think there's a few components. One is, in many ways, our core models actually power other folks in the industry. So we're happy, we kind of at a foundational level want to be the gold standard for being able to detect placements. And then there will be a broad set of folks who have different go-to-market motions, different relationships, and we're happy to power all of them. I think the probably two components that are most differentiated in the way that we think about the technology, one is the underlying accuracy, where I think there's probably been an assumption that a number is the case as we go through a lot of benchmarking in both directions, either placements where you might not know what logo this is, but if you're marking it manually, you might give it credit, or in the other direction of just things that you'll miss because the human eyes glaze over at a certain point. So I think there's a foundational piece of accuracy where, whether it's with us or anybody else, I would advise you to run side by side or head to head and get a sense of that true baseline. I think on top of that, latency is another piece that might not matter to every brand, but I think the ability to have faster data can help. Especially, frankly, for broadcasters where you can maybe make more changes within a given week and actually learn from one program and move on to the next one. So those would be the different components, but again, we're trying to be very friendly across the industry, so happy to continue to power partners.
Thanks, Dan. And again, probably following up on that question, but just to clarify, so you'd mentioned in this presentation, first time I've seen a lot of the amplification, the latency. So compared to, say, Block 6 Analytics, Fan AI, would that be a sweet spot for your organization that perhaps others are not focusing on?
Yeah, so I think from a value chain, different folks will play at different parts of the value chain. I think the pieces that are probably a little bit more unique to Hive than perhaps gets recognized, one is the underlying technology. And so again, some people will build on top of our models with their own valuation, et cetera. And then from a content ingestion perspective, in many cases, folks will source their own content, which doesn't necessarily have all of that shoulder programming. So I think probably the two pieces of uniqueness are just the breadth of data, especially on the TV side, and then the ability to turn that back to clients very quickly. So I think we have one more up front.
Thank you, great presentation. My question, in your valuation, are you factoring in logo size and kind of familiarity into that as well, knowing that like an ESPN is easily recognizable versus a lesser known brand?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the way that we created the equivalency is there's four factors, and it's essentially algorithmic and consistent now, but actually the way that we figured out what those factors were and how they should be weighted was by human input, essentially watching things, not knowing that you're looking for logos and figuring out what stood out. And so the four factors that came in, one was the size of the logo, so how big it is. Second one was how clear, especially in sports, things are moving quickly, something might be blurry, it might be occluded, et cetera. The third one was how central on the screen, and so if something is very close to the center of play, that's going to get more attention than something on the periphery. And then finally, the exclusivity, and so if there's 40 logos on the screen, any given one is going to have a harder time to back out. And so all of those four factors end up coming together for that equivalency component. Good question. One more.
Thank you. How are you working around those 4 factors that you just spoke about? Knowing that sports being in the center maybe is where all the action is happening, but if you actually track people's eyes, they might not just gather in the middle. As action, soccer is probably a little bit different when the camera's a little bit farther away. Are you adjusting those models where there was human input at first, but then you're actually studying human behavior and getting more to a more analytical way of valuing these 4 variables?
Yeah, it's a really good question, especially with the difference of different camera angles for different sports, or even within sports, different broadcasters. And so, yeah, it's not necessarily as algorithmic as distance from the center of the screen as much as from kind of the sweet spot of attention. And so it's not exactly kind of nesting concentric circles. So there's a bit of variability around that. Perfect. All right. Well, thank you all so much. Appreciate it, and hope to stay in touch.